Welcome to this video on Erikson's Malazan Book of the Fallen, and specifically on the character of Silverfox. And just sort of immediately put this out there. This is a spoilers video, so there will absolutely be spoilers for the first three books, but really the focus is on books 1 and 3, so Gardens of the Moon and Memories of Ice, and we'll be looking at Silverfox in those. So before we jump into that, introduce ourselves. I am Erin Keating. I'm an associate prof at the University of Manitoba, and I am doing this channel basically to share parts of my research, parts of my teaching, my interests, hopefully getting conversations with students and stuff that we're working on in collaboration. And so I work on very disparate things. 17th century drama and popular fiction is one, and 20th and 21st century fantasy and popular culture is the other, so a little bit back and forth there. And in terms of Malazan Book of the Fallen, I'm currently on my first reread of that, and I've reread up to Memories of Ice at this point, but I'm planning on doing the rest of the series as soon as I have time. Have with me one of my undergrad research assistants.
Yes, hello. My name is Anastasia Christodoulou. I'm a fifth-year undergraduate honors student here at the University of Manitoba in the English department. And I have the privilege to work with Dr. Keating this summer on her project looking at queer kinship structures in epic fantasy. It's been quite the fun ride so far. I will preface, I am a first-time Malazan reader, so it's been a really cool way for me to explore the books through sort of a queer lens, and that's been our focus, so very excited to talk about that today.
I guess we'll just dive right into it. So as Anastasia just mentioned, we are going to be thinking about queer theory because I think it's actually a really useful way to engage with Erikson's series, and he has a lot of sort of queer temporalities, what we'd consider queer kinship structures, as well as queer objects. I mean, that table, I'm hoping to have a whole video on that at some point, but many other sort of objects in the world that we'd consider queer in the way we're using it. But for this conversation, because that's obviously a lot, we are focusing on particularly Silverfox's birth scene, that chapter in Gardens of the Moon, and her relationship with the Mhybe. And even with that tight focus, as it is a tight focus, there's a lot that could be said there. So this is very much just sort of, here's some ideas, it's a beginning, and hopefully if you find it interesting, you know, you can sort of take this somewhere wherever you want to go with it in terms of what it makes you think of or what it brings to mind for you. So that being said, I'm using the word queer a lot. So I'm going to start with a little bit of an info dump, which is some of the things we've been working with together this summer, and just make it very clear how I'm using the word queer and what I mean by it, because it does mean something particular when we're talking about queer theory in academic parlance. So first off, it implies that really there's a norm that something or someone is queer in relation to, right? But I want to be careful there in the sense that that norm, to be queer is to sort of diverge from that norm, but not necessarily to be opposite of it, right? There's a lot of different ways that one can diverge, so we're not sort of thinking about opposites when we're talking about this. We're not thinking about what the philosophy would call that binary structure of thought. We're thinking about many possible divergences, and I think this is really, really useful in terms of thinking about Erikson, because he plays with these types of things a lot in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Even just with the POVs and the many POVs and the way he uses those to fill in information and world build. But in order to understand, for the purposes of our video, what we're sort of in relation to, I want us to think about the term heteronormativity. And in particular, for the purposes of thinking about Silverfox, in particular, what we're thinking about within heteronormativity is that reproductive nuclear family structure. Right, so this idea that this is still, frankly, within at least North American society, a norm that is very, very influential in structuring our society, our laws, our institutions. So that's sort of a sense, on the one hand, of how we're doing queer theory. Here's, I promise, the second and last part of the info dump on queer theory, and that is adding to this idea of heteronormativity and then queering from that structure of the family and the heteronormative family, I want us to think about and bring in Sara Ahmed's orientations. And she talks about this in Queer Phenomenology, which unfortunately we didn't have time to read this summer. It's a phenomenal book, I highly recommend it. But the way Ahmed writes about orientations is that she's thinking about the way that everything in society and as bodies are in society are oriented in particular ways. And this, she uses, in terms of phenomenology, she talks about this in our relationships to objects, for instance, but also our relationships to society itself, to the spaces within a society is very important to her. And this idea that our orientations within a space and to a particular thing actually shape the way we move through the world in a way that we don't notice usually, right? Because it's so ingrained, it's so, here's this word, natural to us to be moving through those spaces in particular ways. And so I also want to include a quote from Ahmed that I think makes this very clear, and it'll be really useful for what Anastasia is going to talk about very soon. So Ahmed writes, when we are oriented, we might not even notice that we are oriented. We might not even think about this point. When we experience disorientation, we might notice orientation as something we do not have. And I really, really wanted to bring that in because Erikson, and of course the subreddit is full of this, is a master of disorientation, right? He is, and I don't mean confusion by that, right? Like certainly there's often confusion for readers, and that's, I think, part of the journey and something I really enjoy about his novels. But also there's disorientation, where it's almost like Erikson knows how we're going to approach his novels in a particular way in terms of the beliefs and the worldviews and the structures that we sort of have grown up in and that we're bringing to his novels, whether that's society, social, cultural, or fantasy genre. And he intentionally disorients that, right? He disorients us. He doesn't give us what we expect. And so this is just pleasurable. This is just a fun experience.
Yeah.
But also, that moment, according to Ahmed, is one of those things that allows us to see or notice our own orientations. And I think that's really important. And that's what queer theory is trying to do, ultimately, is to make us see what structures us and to think about, can we break those? Should we break those? But to just show them as not natural by queering from them in particular ways, right? So I have talked a lot. So we are actually going to jump into the book. We're going to jump into the dream birth scene, and I will be quiet for a little while.
Wonderful. All right. So thinking a little bit about orientation and how we're oriented to our spaces and to time, I want to just kind of jump right into the sort of birth scene of Silverfox, which happens in Gardens of the Moon. And what is so compelling about this scene, in part, is that it takes place in Kruppe's dream space, this very strange dream space that seems to defy many senses of time. It feels like a collision in a lot of ways of different times and paths layering all over each other. And all the characters kind of have their own orientation to this space and how they exist in this space. And the space that this dream world kind of takes in is less this container or this vessel. It feels more like a space of expanse where there's so much room for possibility and processes of becoming. So despite the fact that everybody in this dream space is sort of collectively oriented in that moment, everybody kind of has their own temporal formation, to borrow terms from Mark Rifkin's Beyond Settler Time, this idea of temporal formation, that we are all uniquely moving through space, and yet, despite these unique pathways, we are all colliding and influencing one another. And Kruppe's dream world, however we choose to kind of think of it, is a very, very cool way that Erikson helps us kind of become disoriented, as you were talking about, because we're all of a sudden like, where are we? Are we in the beginning? Are we in a dream? Are we outside of a dream? what's going on? That was my question when I started reading that scene, and it's very interesting, I should mention, to go back after having read Memories of Ice, and things kind of start to, I don't know, it's very interesting. But anyways, what I think is very compelling to kind of continue on what I was saying is resisting this notion of absolute shared time, right? And this is going back to how we're oriented to spaces, society, structure. We often, especially in the Western world, conceive time as absolute and moving along as sort of singular axis. There's no really room for divergence, and there's no real room for different experiences of existing in time. But here, kind of calling back to Mark Rifkin in Beyond Settler Time, he talks about this idea of temporal multiplicity, and that there are actually many varied ways of being in time and existing in time based on how you are oriented to your spaces, your histories, your perceptions, every life experience that you've had that's come before you. And we see that in this dream. Kruppe is immediately asking, you know, where am I? What is this? Have I come to the beginning of things?
Yeah, and I want to jump to that because I love that part.
Yeah.
And I just want to grab the book.
Yeah.
I won't yet. It's coming, probably. But you're right. When Kruppe is, you know, he's like, okay, I'm in my dream again. We've seen lots of Kruppe's dreams by this point, right? And when he's in his dream again, and he says, he's looking at the landscape, and it's very sort of barren, but there's like really vibrant colored lichen,
Yeah.
and so he's, you know, just sussing out where he is. And he says, you know, have I come to the beginning? And immediately his voice, who we quickly learn is Temporal, says yes, right? And, but on the next page, we learn when Temporal is sort of filling in a little bit of background for Kruppe, that the Amass have been living there for a long time on these plains. And so it makes us immediately, it disorients us, because beginning we think we understand. Beginning, it's a word, we all use it. This is, you know, very common sort of word, but the beginning of what?
Yeah.
So this is the beginning, but it's not the beginning of time, which is what you might think, right? You might think Kruppe is thinking when he gets there, as if time could have a beginning. But that idea that it's clearly the beginning of something, but we don't know what, but that also sort of shows and forces us to think about these shifting different temporalities, right? Like it's a beginning of time for someone, for something.
Totally.
Right?
Well, and I love that idea of beginning, of not having a shared beginning, and we in this dream space, we're hopping into this timeline that feels like a beginning for the Amass, but it's certainly not a beginning for Kruppe or for anyone else, right?
Except Silverfox.
Except Silverfox.
In a way.
In a way,
Yeah.
sort of. Yes, but it is very interesting, and it's interesting to think about the way that we have this sort of queer scene of time and how that facilitates opportunities for survival and resurgence and creation, quite literally, in the form of Silverfox being birthed. I think that it's really powerful to see some of these things being physically manifested in the body of Silverfox. One thing that I find very compelling is how she carries these sort of three, arguably four souls and spirits within her, right? We've got Nightchill, we've got Ballardan, we've got Tattersail, and we've got Silverfox. But we don't see this like merging. We don't see this sense of like fusion into one singular being, and that continues on through Memories of Ice. Like they remain separate within Silverfox, and it's because these souls have all had their own unique journeys through time and through life. They've all have been oriented differently through time, and there would certainly be something lost in the merging of those souls and the loss of that history. And I think it's interesting to think about the ways that time can also become an inheritance, and as Silverfox inherited these timelines, and she carries them with her as she moves throughout her journey throughout the series. So I think that resistance of convergence between the souls speaks to this idea of timelines and how it's really powerful when we break away from this notion of singular, shared, absolute time the possibilities that arise for creation and survival, right? This is what allows, it's Tattersall's effort that allows her to kind of live on and survive. And even going back before, like...
Yeah, but that makes me jump in for a second, because that makes me think about when you were talking about how all of in Memories of Ice, so all of the characters, or so many of them anyway, are very, very invested in trying to figure out who is dominant.
Yes.
Right? Like, they're very invested, like, they want to actually try to force Silverfox into, is it really Tattersall?
Totally.
Is it really Nightchill? Is it really... And that's the wrong orientation.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think that works really well with what you're saying, is that they're trying to do what perhaps we would want to try to do and be like, well, who is it really? But that's the wrong orientation to it. That's the wrong question to ask.
Absolutely. And it comes back to this idea of not one of those souls within Silverfox is more valuable or deserves to be inherently more privileged than any other. Rifkin, going so much to Rifkin, but
that's fine.
He's nice. Yeah, is that we have this idea that despite the fact that we may all be experiencing a similar moment, there is no reason to privilege somebody else's perspective or someone else's experience of time over any other. So it's not a question about dominancy or one must power through, right? There's no reason that any perspective would be more valuable or any soul would be more valuable, but of course, they're tools and people become tools in different ways, and some people are easier to work with than others, let's just say.
So there's a really great quote that brings this sort of all together in terms of what you're talking about from Gardens of the Moon, from that chapter, and it's Pranchol, and basically what he's saying is, within you is the past, present, my world. You know the present, and the Ribby offers you the future. In this place, all is merged. And I think that just sort of beautifully sums up what you're trying to sort of say about this. But also think about why that's important, right?
Totally.
Like, it's important to us because we're thinking about, it's not just that they're merged into one, they're merged into a sort of shifting coalescence of orientations.
Totally.
Right?
And it's this idea that when we are released from this imposed straightness of time, we have this opportunity for all these different timelines, like that temporal multiplicity, to all exist alongside each other and interact with each other and fuse and unfuse. And it's really powerful and really certainly sets up much of, obviously, the plot and what goes on.
Next.
Yeah.
in so many ways, in the
Yes.
entire series and in the other series. But I want to jump from that into sort of specifically thinking about, and what you gestured towards, just that makeup of Silverfox, right? Like the makeup of the souls. Because this is a birth scene, in a way, but definitely a birth scene. And so I want to think about this in terms of its relationship to that heteronormativity that I mentioned at the start of the video, and that emphasis in sort of our orientation from a North American perspective on that reproductive nuclear family. Because this is reproduction. I want to push for that, and I'll sort of qualify that a little bit later. But it's also, as we sort of know, it's a soul shifting, right? So this isn't someone who was conceived biologically, and I think that's really important in how this is being represented, that we keep in mind, right? That Silverfox is not conceived with, a sperm, an egg. In a way, in the way it's sort of talked about in this, it's like she's conceived by the Warren, right? That Kruppe is sort of allowed to have in the dream. We don't need to talk about how exactly that works. And as Anastasia just mentioned, is made up of those 4 souls, right? We learn that in Memories of Ice in a conversation where Kruppe is talking to Quickben. We have added on that Silverfox is the seed of Pranchol's daughter, right? So we have the 4 souls plus this sort of new element, if you will. And the Mhybe, in fact, sort of also refers to 3 souls and herself as sort of part of that as well, and as actually as parents, right? It's sort of like a reluctant family. And she says, one father and 3 reluctant mothers, right? Which is great. And of course, Anastasia is going to talk a little bit about that later when we talk about the Mhybe, who's an amazing character. But this idea that even in those two, sort of bringing those together, those 3 souls are both the child and involved in the conception, but also the parents, right? So we've broken that down. We've broken down that and any sort of clear disconnect or severing of those 2 things, right? So already the nuclear family is starting to be queered in particular ways. And so the other thing I think that's really useful to think about in terms of this sort of reproductive moment and about the family is, and links to what we were just talking about, is that often with children, particularly in contemporary North American culture, and Edelman has some great stuff about this that we don't want to go into here, but the child is often associated as sort of the figure of futurity, right? So a child is always oriented to the future. And this is something also that's being queered here, right? Because this child is past, present, and future, right? So we're breaking down this notion of futurity, we're breaking down this nuclear family structure, we're breaking down heteronormative biological reproductivity in like really, really fun and interesting ways. And the thing is, the reason that I'm sort of saying that this is over against that is Erikson is also reminding us of it throughout this scene, right? So it's not like this is something wildly convergent, wildly different. We are reminded of that norm, and then it diverges because we're reminded of the pregnant body, right? With the ribby woman who we later know as the Mhybe, right? The pregnant ribby woman who's the scene of her body, the scene of her labor, is reminding us of this as birth, but then all of these other details are queering that birth in a really cool way.
And I don't recall who says it, but in the dream scene, somebody says this is a birth in truth.
Yes.
Which makes you question how this is totally not a birth in truth, other than the passage through
the body.
The body. Yeah, the body.
The passage through the body.
Yeah.
But, and absolutely, and it's also, and this is another sort of moment stepping outside that heteronormative, when Kruppe asks about where the sort of child, right, has come from, the actual physical sort of body that the souls are being shifted into, and it's, we don't lift that veil, but what suffice it to say, though, that she has not known any man. Right? So again, this is not a biological conception on any sort of level that we're familiar with, right? That we tend to associate with the human anyway. And so the other thing I want to sort of mention in terms of that labor is even when the ribby woman goes into labor, in a weird way, it's not just her who is birthing, right? So we have basically Kruppe's warren as being sort of referred to as sort of almost midwifing it in. I forget the exact term they use. But also, in that moment, the descriptions of Pranchol are so good because both bodies appear to be in labor, right? Both Pranchol and the ribby woman. And we're going to quote this really quickly because I think it's worth it to remind us, right, of how Erikson is doing this and giving us the laboring body, but again, queering it because now we have 2 laboring bodies. And so the quote sort of starts, the passage starts, I should say, the ribby had assumed a squatting position, moving with the rhythm of labor, her face sheathed in sweat. Pranchol remained immobile, though his body was racked in shivering bouts that twisted his face with pain. Right? So this idea of the pain of labor being shared, right? Not just the woman. And so one last point on this, because it's so dense, and this is so very Erikson as well, right? Like many of his things are what I would call overdetermined. We're getting layers upon layers upon layers to sort of make sure we're sort of noticing these divergences and sort of rewarding the careful reader. Like Erikson always rewards the careful reader. That's why I love teaching his texts, because careful reading, it really pays off with him. And this also happens, and I am going to grab the book for this, because in this scene, on page 336, those of you who have the Tor edition, is Kruppe is asking Krull, sort of in this about, they're discussing Silverfox, they're discussing the scene, and he uses the word parents, which is interesting considering everything I just said, right? And he says, so okay, there it says, considering her parents, she will indeed be exceptional. And this is just a line, right? And we, of course, recognize the word parents. We have certain assumptions, orientations toward the word parents in various ways. And so we pass by this as, oh, of course. But then if we stop, who is he referring to? Right, like, who are her parents? Who does Kruppe think her parents are? Who does the reader think her parents are? And because of this, it's that defamiliarization that creates the scrutiny that breaks down the very notion of parentage, that like queers the very notion of parentage, because, and Kruppe will do this often, he'll speak about things as if they're matter of fact, and so you follow him until you realize, wait a minute, I don't understand what he's talking about. And so I think this is a really sort of important moment in that, which also is just one of the beauties of Kruppe in showing, though it's Erikson behind Kruppe, rewarding us for noticing these divergences, noticing the queering of these things that we take for granted in a lot of ways, right? And so I think that brings us into perhaps parentage and the Mhybe, and we can sort of move on to that.
Absolutely. Okay, so now jumping into one of my favorite characters, which is the Mhybe, that we sort of get to see her journey in Memories of Ice. There's been some conversations, absolutely, about motherhood in Memories of Ice, because it's such a big topic, arguably, with, the Mhybe, and we've got the matron and the Jagut mother. And on Critical Dragons YouTube channel, they have a spoiler talk where they discuss motherhood in Memories of Ice, AP Canavan, and Philip Chase. And I loved listening to that conversation because it's so true, the ways in which sacrifice becomes such a quintessential theme for these mothers, and also the ways in which the moms, specifically the Mhybe, are presented as victims of their circumstance and of their condition, which is, motherhood, not to pathologize motherhood in any sense, but it is really fascinating to come down to the Ribi word, the Mhybe, where they refer to it as a vessel or a single-use container meant for discard. And the ways in which the Mhybe very much feels this and feels her body degrading, feels her body just almost rotting, like her flesh rotting off her bones as she is giving away her life force and her vitality, not from a sense of choice, but because this is her circumstance. And it's fascinating to me the ways in which this mother-daughter bond between Silverfox and the Mhybe is not romanticized. It is aromanticized. It is, motherhood becomes this thing that is caustic and corrosive, and we see this very, very parasitic nature where there is no mutualism, and it is consumption, and it is food, and it is so, it's compelling, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but it's compelling in the ways in which she is so dehumanized in her circumstance as food for her child, but she's also offered a lot of compassion and tenderness. But that language that language of consumption where she says in Memories of Ice, I am no more than food to the child, not even my child, to the child, she devours me.
Yeah.
It's just, oh my God. So kind of thinking more about this idea of parasitism and this parent bond that is certainly not mutualistic for both parties involved. There is so much language of consumption in the book, and I know on the 10 Very Big Books podcast they did talk about this, and Erikson was on that podcast and spoke about this like vampiricism and how describing the relationship between the Mhybe and Silverfox as very vampiric, and some of that language that is used is just so powerful and heartbreaking. And there's and that reminds me of another passage which I really wanted to read, although it's very long, a little bit, but
it sort of strikes me, it's sort of funny, because I was preparing notes and rereading this scene, and I'm currently fostering a mother cat with 4 kittens, and they're in the 5 weeks weaning stage, right? And the poor mother cat is just skin and bones, and you're trying to feed her, but they are literally sucking that life force out of her to sustain. But the important thing is that that weaning process weans them off the sustenance, right?
Yeah.
And this has never happened with the Mhybe, which is why I think the vampiric or parasitic is one that works really well as a metaphor for what's happening here. But we are going to look at this, and because it's a beautiful and striking and heartbreaking passage, frankly, in Memories of Ice. And so it begins, spirits below, I would rather even your terror of the unknown, rather that than the knowledge of my daughter's betrayal. The wolves that she has set upon me to pursue me in my dreams. And of course, remember, this is when the Mhybe is having these dreams, she doesn't understand, right, what is happening, even though they're trying to help her. So the wolves, which are her hunger, right, that the hunger which has already devoured my youth and yet now seeks yet more, as if anything's left. Am I to be naught but food for my daughter's burgeoning lights, food again, a final meal, a mother reduced to nothing more than sustenance? Ah, Silverfox, are you every daughter? Am I every mother? There have been no rituals severing our lives. We have forgotten the meaning behind the very ways, the true reasons for those rituals. I ever yield, and you suckle in ceaseless demand. And so we are trapped, pulled deeper, you and I. It's like this idea that, you know, she hasn't been weaned, right? And this sort of goes on, I'm skipping a bit, but she says, you know, I have never weaned you, Silverfox. Indeed, you have never left my womb. You, daughter, draw for more than just milk. Spirits, please grant me surcease. This cruel parody of motherhood is just too much to bear. And like that is, it's heartbreaking. And I know the Mhybe is a controversial figure in the fandom. It's not everyone's cup of tea when they're first reading Memories of Ice, but that passage is so beautiful and so heartbreaking, and there's such sort of sorrow, but also anger, and just because it's completely unfair and yet so necessary, right?
Totally.
That she has to do this for her daughter, and she even strikes this earlier as kinship. Like, this is how she describes it when someone's sort of asking about, you know, the other souls, the Tlan Mass, and, you know, why does it all fall on the Mhybe? And she actually says, I'm her only kin that has a life force to give her, right? Because all of those other elements are dead. And so this idea that it all falls on her, this is a horrible burden.
Totally.
But I'll let you jump back.
No, but I was going to say, like, that idea of a cruel parody of motherhood is such a powerful line because, you know, the Mhybe can't offer her lessons or wisdom. There are parts of Silverfox that the Mhybe does not know and has never known, and there is so much sorrow in her voice and how she loves Silverfox but hates what Silverfox is doing to her. And what's so sad, and just going back to that point of like these mothers being victims, is that despite, I mean, she obviously gets this sort of paradise at the end, and in the 10 Very Big Books podcast, Erikson refers to that ending for the Mhybe as being a sort of paradise, but there is something still so sorrowful in that she didn't have the autonomy to save herself, and she remained crippled, like she had to be saved, which is beautiful. That compassion is beautiful, but there is so much sorrow, and it's so powerful. Right. And kind of tying back into what the word Mhybe means and how this becomes this vessel, this single-use, you know, container for discard, I think it is fascinating to think about the ways in which the Mhybe sort of resists that sort of imposed upon fate, and that she is not discarded. She becomes more than a vessel, arguably. At the end, she gets her freedom, she gets her youth back. And not only that, but Erikson allows her to become so much more than just a vessel or container by honoring her humanness. And I think arguably, and I know that a lot of people do not like the Mhybe's incessant complaining, but you know what, it's funny because for me those are some of my favorite parts of the book, and it made me emotional because how beautiful that she got the privilege in this story to express her pain and her rage and her anger and to sort through her emotions. I think this idea of like women suffering in silence, you know, we don't always need that. Sometimes that suffering is allowed to be vocalized and thought and felt. And the fact that she's showing that compassion with Cole and Murillo, and it's so tender and it's so beautiful, and there's a sense of infinity to her story, and she very much, you know, tying back to temporality, defies the temporality that she is that she is subjected to. She is able to continue on, and that's part of, you know, the queering elements of the stories. What can be allowed when we have different visions of time, or how time moves and flows. So that's
so ashamed here.
Yeah.
I mean, because I have to admit that I'm one of those readers when I read the first time. Yeah. I would get so impatient, and I was like, why is she whining? And it's like, not enjoying reading this scene, and coming back to it, it's definitely experienced it very, very different on the reread.
Totally.
When I sort of understood more of what was going on. But I think you're absolutely right in that this is really important that she's given that space, and it's almost sort of pointing to maybe some of our own failures of compassion.
Totally.
When we get impatient
totally.
with
Absolutely.
her in those moments, I will confess.
Absolutely.
I think that's an important thing to think about. And again, what Erikson's often doing is we're coming to this with an orientation, and we're getting pushed out of it in various ways, and part of that can be an affective one, right? Like an emotional one about how we're feeling towards different characters. And we're forced to maybe examine those feelings and the reasons behind them a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's important.
Yeah.
But I mean, we've talked a bunch about mothers.
Yes, a lot about mothers.
Right? So I want to move a little bit into fathers. Because I think there's some really interesting things, like thinking back again as we're thinking about queering this text, or the way that we can think about Erikson as queering things in particular ways. And so the question of the father for Silverfox, because as I sort of mentioned earlier, like Mhybe cites herself as Silverfox's only sort of real living kid in particular ways. And so with Silverfox herself, though, in Memories of Ice, she's shown as almost looking for like other kin, or in particularly sometimes for a father or a father figure, right? So the way she's written by Erikson, it's constantly sort of reminding us of that nuclear family that she very much diverges from, right? So we're always getting those reminders as we're going through. And it happens in like a number of places, but one of them is thinking about how she adopts like Whiskey Jack as an uncle, right? So this idea when she meets Whiskey Jack and they're talking, and of course there's an element of the Tattersall soul remnant in here that's influencing that relationship. But that sense of like that adopting the language of this familial language, this kin language with this man whom, of course, readers and characters alike very much admire in this series. So there's that sort of sets it up early in Memories of Ice. But then in the second gathering, there's a really, really interesting moment where Silverfox sort of thrusts Pranchol into the role of father, sort of saying, you know, speaking to him as if he is her father, labeling him her father, and he actually acquiesces into that. And he accepts that role, and that sort of seemingly like settles us then into that familiar, so where we've become oriented again, right? Like it's seeming for this moment to reassert that structure as sort of natural, as something that will eventually, we will find this figure, and it will have that structure. But you also had another way of reading that scene. And so I want like that moment. I want to sort of include that because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, totally. I think it's really interesting to look at that scene and that moment of Pran taking on that responsibility for Silverfox as a way of sort of making kin outside of heterosexual biological reproduction, because Silverfox was not reproduced through traditional biological means. it's this moment where Pran feels a connection to Silverfox and decides to step up. And it was making me think a little bit about some of Kim TallBear's work, where she discusses ways of making kin and caring for kin outside of these very traditional nuclear family structures that are often imposed through institutions, colonialism, all these things. So it's an interesting way to think about the ways that we can care for someone and take on these roles that may be very, very heteronormative labels, fathering and mothering, but the ways that that can be assumed not just through the actual biological father, but because you care and because you see a need and you step up to meet that need, I think can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, and I love that, like the creation of kin through actions, through acceptance of responsibility, through care, rather than through biology.
Totally.
Or even through like marital structure, or like these other things, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. And even in the novel, if we get back to that, it's this attempt to sort of put Pran Chol in that role gets interrupted right away by another bone caster. His name escapes me off the top of my head, but he actually rejects that and brings in this idea that if there's a sort of a father figure here, it would be the one whose Talan Warren was unveiled such that Tattersall was able to, that whole thing was able to happen. We're going to go into the details. You've all read it if you're watching this video, hopefully. Not spoilers. But so this idea of if it was because of, the Clan Warren, if we can think of that as a type of fatherhood, then it's Unis Tulin, or your tool.
Totally.
Which is wild because this, and I love, Erikson does this so often, and I talk about this a lot with Gardens of the Moon, but when I'm teaching it, this idea of this thing comes from left field, right? You're just like, this someone you haven't thought about for a little while, or you've thought about only in relation to talk, the youngers and the other storylines here, and all of a sudden it's like, well, no, if there is a father, it's Tool, and that connection gets made in a way that sort of reminds you both narratively of different things, but also shows you the paucity of that even pseudo-biological notion of fatherhood.
Totally.
Because he has no relationship to the storyline, to what's going on right now, to Silverfox. And so it's showing how, it's revealing how that is almost the wrong question to be asking.
Totally.
Right? Like Silverfox looking for a father, that's just the wrong frame. It's the wrong orientation, right? To go back with what we started. And it shows that this whole idea of the orientation of the heteronormative, the orientation of the nuclear family, the orientation of that particular type of reproductivity, and even that child that's oriented toward futurity, as opposed to these other timelines, all of that is diverged from in Erikson's book, and none of that gives us the necessary sort of frame to understand what's happening here or appreciate what's happening here, despite the fact that he's always reminding us of it, because he knows we're coming to it with this frame, right? Like he's doing this, I think, very intentionally, and hopefully, ideally, to go back to sort of Ahmed and pointing out those orientations and forcing us to think about those orientations, we question, or at the very least ponder, the way that we too often consider them natural.
Totally.
Right? To go back to that and force us to sort of think about that in particular ways. And I mean, that's why queer theory, I think, is such a fun way, right, to approach this novel. And I think, that's all I had to say. I know that was lots. Those of you who made it this far, thank you. That is great. I'm so appreciative of you sort of joining into this conversation. Please continue to join in if you want to in the comments. Hopefully, if Anastasia has time and desire, we might make a couple more of these on different topics coming from our summer conversations. And love for the series, and perhaps as she continues to read the series, we'll see where that goes. But otherwise, thanks for watching.